For those of you that I haven't met, I'm Jerry Halpin from the Historic Society, and I want to welcome you to tonight's lecture. So a little bit of advertisement. As you know, the Historical Society is a membership organization that is financed by the memberships, donations, and our fundraisers. And I would encourage any of you that are not already a member, please join. There are membership brochures in the back. Also, for those of you that this is your first time here, you could sign in and leave us your email address. We would appreciate that too. As many of you have seen on Main Street, that we're nearing completion of phase 1 of our construction project for the gift shop and museum. Painters are in, so which really is a good sign. It means that we're getting close to the end. With the donations and pledges we have to date, we have raised the $450,000 we need for that phase of the project. We thought that was going to be enough for all of the project, but unfortunately, because of inflation and supply chain issues, we don't have all the money raised for phase 2, which is fixing the historic Dottridge homestead. Right now, there is I'd say probably a 1950s era bathroom in there, which isn't really keeping with the 1800s home. We would like to have that taken out since we now have new bathroom facilities in the building we're just finishing up now. So any donations you would like to make this evening, there's a donation box in the back also. We would greatly appreciate it, and we'll go towards that phase 2 project. Also, we've had several questions recently. Are we videotaping this for people that can't come? And the answer is yes. Our administrator, Kara, is making videotapes, and we're putting them on our website. So let anyone know that you think would like to see this presentation in the future. It'll be on our website. If you've missed some during the summer, they're all up on our website too, so I'd encourage you to watch those also. So, without further ado, tonight I have the pleasure of welcoming Phil Odence, who's going to be discussing the evolving maps of Cotuit. It's sort of hard to introduce someone that's sort of a fixture in town, but Phil has been a lifelong summer resident and is now a full-time resident. Phil's also been actively involved with the Historic Society with past projects and past presentations for this Chronicles series. I really want to express our appreciation for everything Phil has done for us and the Historic Society. We're much more richer because of that. I'm going to let Phil tell you a little bit more about his background as well as the evolving maps of Cotuit. So, Phil.
Sure. Thank you, Jerry. Jerry told me to expect an older crowd tonight. When I saw John Hobble walk in, it brought the average down below 80. So I think I will introduce myself a little more. But one thing I'll tell you is that I'm a map guy from way back. As a child, I was always fascinated by maps. I kind of wonder why I never went into that field, because it's a really interesting time, and it's a great. But regardless, it's a great time to be a map lover. A great time to be alive. Both with access to older maps online as well as all kinds of very interesting newer maps. And so I'm going to walk through pretty much every map I've been able to find that zeroes in on Cotuit, going back a few centuries. And I'm hoping that this is a big enough projection that you can see what I'm talking about for most of these, but a lot of these maps are available online. We're going to have copies of many of them in the research center upstairs in the new construction of the Historical Society. So think of this as a reference and a pointer. And if there's anything of particular interest, email me. I'm going to put up my email at the end, and I'm happy to point you to where you can find these maps. As Jerry said, and most of you know, because I know many of you here, I'm a longtime summer resident. I think this was year 0 at Loop Beach, and this was a couple of years later. And I remember that there was the way the bubbler worked was there were 2 holes, and if you stuck your finger in, you could make it shoot up like that, but somebody must have jammed a pebble in there or something. So I was pretty happy with that. So yeah, I've been here a lot of summers, and now more or less full-time, a little bit up in Boston, but more or less here full-time. And we had a house over on Lewis Pond Road for many years, but then bought what is still kind of known as Nancy Grant's house. And that's an old house, we think late 1800s construction, and that kind of got me interested in houses in Cotuit. And I started blogging about that project. It was a pretty interesting project. It was sort of a blow by blow on the construction. But that got me looking around at other houses, and I walk a lot in Cotuit, and I thought a lot about it. And I also, as well as liking maps, I've always been partial to mansard roofs. I've never owned a house with a mansard roof, but they're what I used to think of as a Cotuit house. And so I did some research into that and teamed up with Jim Gould, who'd done the same. And we did a talk sitting right here a few years ago on the Mansard Ladies, and we published a little book through the Historical Society on that. I've gotten involved in some other projects, another one very house related, and I don't know if you've seen it, but I hope you have, but if you haven't, you can go to the website and you get a nice map of Cotuit with a dot for every historical home, and you can right click on that or drill through and bring up a little summary of the history of the architecture and the history of the house, and it also provides some links to some other references on every house and has some pictures, and that's the Child's Homestead's My House, so that's what you're seeing there. And I did a talk on that. That actually worked well. It was during COVID and it was on video on Zoom, so people could see the maps pretty well. And then most recently, I teamed up with Larry Ty. And there's some other side projects, but these are the visible ones. But I teamed up with Larry Ty and followed up on some great work that Betty Peck started in 1978 to record oral histories. I've done a lot of genealogy, and the first thing you hear from every genealogist is, first of all, figure out the oldest people in the family and go talk to them first. And so we figured out the oldest people in the Cotuit family and have been trying to get around and have interviewed several people in this room, and others of you are on the hit list. And so those have just started going up in the last few months, and you have a picture and a little short bio on each person, and then you can click into it and hear a recording. And I have to say that some of the ones Betty did from 1978 are just take me right back to my youth. Mr. Pell's was a really compelling one, hearing him talk about his youth in Cotuit and going off to World War I, and talking a little bit about his father, who was before my time. But really interesting to hear those voices literally from the past, and I think that helps me to project forward a few decades and think about the value of getting today's stories down on tape. So that's what I've been working on. And in the course of doing the research on the houses mostly, I found myself going to a lot of maps. I guess maybe that's obvious. And I started noticing things, and in particular was interested in a number of streets that changed names over the years. So don't shout out any answers. We'll circle back and we'll try to touch on all of these. But anybody heard of County Road? Could you identify it a little bit? Okay. East Main Street, that was a street in Cotuit. Handy Street, not a surprise with all the handies in town, right? Bayview Avenues, because I've got two of them that are about a mile and a half apart. Okay. Shore Street, Charlie Gifford's Roads. You probably know who Charlie Gifford is, but I've got a map that will show you Charlie Gifford's Road. And then this one, I'm guessing somebody knows. Okay, there's at least one Maple Street, although I don't know if it's Maple Street or Maple Avenue, because I can show you deeds that refer to Maple Avenue, and I can show you maps that refer to Maple Avenue, and I can show you people who swear it was Maple Avenue. And I can find plenty of Maple Street references as well. All right, so this is the oldest map I've been able to find that had any detail on Cotuit. I mean, you can find maps of North America, right? But this is some pretty good detail. And it was on all these maps. I'm going to try to sort of start wide and zoom in. So I'll start with like the shoreline, and then maybe some of the features as you get into the map. But this was a map that was done in 1795. It was done by a guy called, I think it's Samuel Bassett. It's handwritten up in the corner of the map, and this one you can get to online. If you Google 1795 Barnstable town map, the town of Barnstable site actually has a very high resolution version of this, and there's like a handwritten note in the upper corner that talks about I couldn't exactly understand what it said. It kind of looked like Samuel Bassett had checked it out at the library at the courthouse in Boston, but then I think it was just a funny way they phrased it. I think he actually drew the map. And Bassett, the double S, I think was done with a single character, but I think the word's Bassett. Anyway, so what do you see? First of all, the coastline is where I draw my attention. And one of the things I noticed is the peninsula is kind of narrow down there. And I get the feeling, because all this is laid out pretty well. I mean, somebody surveyed it and triangulated and all that, Samuel Bassett presumably. So I think it's probably accurate. And I think this skinny part, on all these maps, I question, is it, if something looks peculiar, is it a mistake? Is it the accuracy of the map, or is it revealing something interesting? But I think this was Rushy Marsh Pond before it was a pond. I think that indentation there. And you'll see in the next map, it sanded over and there's an entrance to Rushy Marsh Pond. But I think that accounts for the narrowness. What else stands out, of course, is this island that extends almost from Codman Point down to Oregon, later to be called Sampson's Island, and we'll get to that. And the entrance to the harbor being here. And I think many of you probably know that for years that was the entrance to the harbor. And that's one thing we'll look at on all the maps is how that evolves. And then, of course, this neck, which is ultimately to be called Dead Neck, is joined over in Wiano. And so the only way into any of these harbors is right through here. All of these boundaries are laid out, and I think it's compass bearing and number of rods. So, okay, I had to Google it too. A rod is 16 and a half feet, which is an odd number, but it turns out 4 of them is my math right, 62 feet, no, 66 feet. And if you do, and that's called, is it in my notes?
Chain.
A chain, thank you. And 10 square chains, so 1 by 10 or 2 by 5 is an acre. So I'm guessing they started with an acre and then got down to a chain and then a rod within a chain. And so they're all laid out that way. The other thing you can look at is some of the names. So we've got Oyster Island here, what we'll come to call Grand Island or Oyster Harbor, so we'll say more. And then what we would call Cotuit Bay is referred to as Oyster Bay. And that's another theme that's going to come up throughout all of this is, my sense is people call things different stuff, right down to Cotuit. And you can see here, and Cotuit versus Santuit. In the picture book that Jim and Jessica put together, it says that Cotuit and Santuit were used pretty interchangeably. I haven't seen so much of that. It seemed to me Santuit came in later, and we'll see as we go. But even Cotuit was spelled differently a lot of times. These are all different spellings that showed up prior to this map, and many of them, different spellings were actually in what they called land division records from 1702. The history goes back to Miles Standish and the middle of the 17th century with the kettle and the hoe and all that stuff. And then, and these are all different spellings before then. But this map makes no mention of Cotuit. It's just a map of Barnstable, and there were a few people living here, and most of them were named Crocker. There were some Crockers before. I always thought Ebenezer was the first. I gathered there were a few Crockers around before Ebenezer, but then he is one of these folks who hired Bobby Hayden to move a house down from Barnstable Village. The first Crocker house, the one on the northeast corner of 130 and 28, was the first house, and he moved it down. And I think it was a small cape that just got added onto its current Federalist style. But that was all 60 years before any of this. And there's some other interesting anomalies or differences here. What we call Lovell's Pond was called Fuller's Pond. What we would today call Santuit Pond was referred to as Long Pond. Mashpee, of course, was referred to as Marshpee, and you've probably seen that before. And if you say Marshpee with a little bit of a local accent, it pretty quickly morphs to Mashpee. And it was referred to as a plantation. We'll say more about that, but Mashpee was a plantation, and it was really the first reservation for the natives. And we know how reservations go, so we'll look into that. So so the roads. So they're hard to see, but coming down from here, you see one road coming across and one road angling down like that. And best I can figure, that was probably a native path that got improved, both of them. And one is Falmouth Road, Route 28. And then the one angling down from Marston's Mills, oddly goes to here. And that's because the Crockers were operating a mill, which became called the Sampson's Mill, but this was before the Sampsons married into the Crocker family. But the road ends right there. Well, I think it's just that the map ends there because it was a map of Barnstable, and that was Marshpee on the other side. But an interesting detail there is that the river actually went up into both sides of the river. There were part of Mashpee, and the mill was actually in Mashpee, and then that was changed later and subsumed into the town of Barnstable. Okay, so we fast forward a few decades to 1831, and you've got a barn.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Is it possible to dim the lights?
That's probably a good idea.
Yeah.
Thanks, Keith.
Since you just bear with me, just keep playing with.
Well, that's good.
Beautiful.
Yeah, no, great idea. Thanks, Keith. So we're up to 1831, and the legislature of Massachusetts 2 years earlier had said every town has to have a map, and presumably with some specifications. And so Barnstable picked a guy called Hales to do that map. Now, what's going on at this point in Cotuit is we're starting to move from a little cluster of houses that were farming up on Falmouth Road to more of a maritime industry. So that was, that's the backdrop. If we look at the coast, we see Poppanesset Neck, interestingly, which is what we would call Cotuit still. And again, here's a little more substantiation for the idea that it was skinny because Russian Marsh Pond had not yet been enclosed. And then you've got this island here still. It's still extending pretty far down, and the entrance to the harbor still being through this spot where we know it was for many years. And Dead Neck now has a name. It's called Sandbar. Not very exciting. We see sort of the early version of Grand Island. It was called Great Island, or actually Osterville Great Island. And oddly, here we have Oster, O-S-T-E-R Island, harbor. So that's our little harbor, around Hooper's Landing and Ropes Beach, up towards Little River. It's called Oster Island. Cotuit is now CET. As I said, you can see here's the mill now, and the Santuit River, the east side of what we would call the Santuit River. There it was the CET Cotuit River, but the east side of it is now part of the town of Barnstable. Falmouth Road is labeled up top for the first time, and I'll observe that this road here that now stops at what we would call Main Street, and previously it seemed to extend from up over here down through parts of I guess that was called Old Kings Road, something like that. But these things change over time, and you can't quite see it, but it looks like there might be an indication of a path through the woods. But looking at some other roads, so you've got this road that goes up to Falmouth Road, and that's not Main Street. Main Street is going to end up going over here, but there's that section of Main Street isn't there yet. So this is really Newtown Road, which is another one. And I was going to make a disclaimer at the beginning. Working on this presentation, I wrote a paper, so there's going to be a paper published. And just preparing for this presentation, I kept finding new stuff. And I think this is the way it is with history. I'm guessing most historians go through this and have to say, okay, I'm going to stop now, and I know that I'm going to discover more stuff that I wish I'd included. And one was, Fran Parks pointed out to me, another road that changed names was she never knew where Santuit Newtown came from. And she always called it Newtown Road, and then it just showed up on a street sign. And Fran was observing that. So that's what we call Newtown Road, or now Santuit Newtown Road, out of nowhere. So you're also starting to see houses. So we got little black rectangles representing houses, and I've gotten a sense through this that the area started to be known as Cotuit, but I think Little River, the Little River settlement was as known as the high ground, which we'll talk about, or Cotuit up here, or what comes to be called Cotuit Port. I think they were all just considered little mini villages. And the concept of Cotuit would still take some decades to kind of solidify. So you can see there are about 30 structures if you count the rectangles. You got a few here, a few in the Little River area, a couple of odd ones up around North Bay, and then right where we are here, and then the settlement in the high ground. And I think you all know the story of that the Nickersons who came in the early 1900s started down here and found after a few storms that the land was just too low. You didn't want to live there, so they moved to the high ground. And that's another one. Is it the high ground? Is it the highlands? Is it the highland? And you'll see all kinds of references. Couple other things, you'll see that this is starting to look like a port, and this little square with some markings in it, I'm pretty sure is a salt works, because Daniel Childs, who lived in my house, had a salt works at the foot of the hill right next to what's now the boat launch ramp, and there's another salt works here that I think had been started by Squire Sampson, whose house, by the way, is now visible here. So Sampson's Folly, as it's known, is visible on that road down to his mill. He's gone by this point. I think he passed away in around 1820, as I recall. So about 30 houses in what we call Cotuit today. And there's some interesting contemporary accounts from Andrew Lovell, who was born around 1815, I think, and Abigail Dottridge Nickerson, who was, I think, a daughter of Samuel Dottridge, and they wrote about their childhood, and from those accounts that pretty much substantiate. She went through and actually enumerated how many houses were in these different sections of town, and it pretty much jives with what you'd count on the map. The Andrew Lovell one was interesting, and if you do any research, there's a bunch of references in various historical society papers to this, but he talked about, he remembered, so the Lovells grew up in, he was born, his father was also Andrew Lovell, he was a sea captain, as was this Andrew Lovell, in the Little River area, and he talked about going to visit Captain Nickerson. Of course, there's a million of them, and I'm not remembering which one it was, but they were going to the high ground, and he sort of complained in his account about having to get out of the carriage 7 times to move fences which were there to hold cows in, and so there were 7 fences. What's odd to me, and I haven't figured out, is there's a road down from Santuit to here, downtown here, and there's one that goes down to Ocean View, but there doesn't seem to be a way to get from here to here, and yet it kind of doesn't make sense that these 2 clusters of houses wouldn't be connected, and certainly it sounded like Andrew Lovell, made it that way, and I don't imagine it was going way north to come south. So there must have been must have been a road that wasn't indicated on the map. So this is one I haven't seen a lot of copies of. There are a few. This one actually this particular copy came from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. And it was a coastal survey. I've heard other references to the survey. It was the whole coast of Massachusetts was done. In fact, it may have been broader than that, but there was at least the coast of Massachusetts. And I saw some references to this really being the first very accurate picture of the shape of the coast. So that was kind of interesting. And that was the orientation as the coast. So, you know, I take with a grain of salt some of the more inland features, although from what I can tell, I have to say it looks pretty accurate. It was put together by a surveyor called Boyce. It seemed like the work of doing this mass coastal survey was meted out to a number of different surveyors, and Boyce had this area. Again, the harbor entrance, there's a little sand spit, and some of these features I think are more you know, spits that are covered at high tide at least, or maybe just shallow areas, not actually, you know, above the water. And you'll see that here. We now have Rushy Marsh Pond, and it kind of looks like it's closed off. But what we know is that in fact it was open because at this time, as the maritime industry is beginning to take off, you know, there's a lot of whaling captains that are taking big ships out of here or some out into Bedford or Nantucket, but more so there are a few dozen coastal schooners that are doing a pretty brisk trade up and down the coast, and many of them able to moor inside what is called here Osterville Harbor, but we don't think of it that way, Cotuit Harbor, and many of them would winter over in Rushy Marsh because it was, I guess, more protected. And I think they froze in. You know, I think it froze and they froze in, but it didn't get, you know, pummeled with waves and such. So they would winter over there. Sampson's Island is labeled as such, and again, he's gone at least by 1846. I don't think the spit here has a name. Now we see Grand Island for the first time, or Osterville Grand Island, as it says, and in Osterville Harbor. And for the first time, we see the nomenclature Cotuit Port. So for a lot of years, Cotuit remained the settlement of Crockers up on Falmouth Road. And to distinguish what we were talking about down here, this neighborhood, it was called Cotuit Port. And this is not labeled the high ground, but it was commonly referred to as the high ground. And again, Little River separately. Along by the yacht club and, you know, kind of direct in the direction of Handy Point, it says North Wharf. So I think that Samuel Hooper has not yet arrived. I think he's a few years from arriving in 1846. But there are you know, there's the beginnings of a wharf, and then Samuel Hooper, who lived in what's now the Danhauser House and was owned by the Ropeses for many years, he really started to build up an operation there. We'll talk more about him. Generally, there's more settlement. We do have the little black square or rectangle convention, and there's more houses. It's starting to look like maybe 50 houses or something like that. And some of the shapes of streets in the Cotuit Port area are starting to look familiar. So you've got Old Shore Road going down here, not looping around, but the other end of it's up here. You've got a road here that is not familiar and went extinct, but there was a road from about the top of where Coolidge butts into Main Street now that went straight down. It must have been pretty steep. It went straight down to the harbor. And you'll see in some later maps, the Colemans had a store at the top and a house. A house at the top and a store at the bottom that served the wharf. Yeah, so I think that's it. Oh yeah, there was another one. This I didn't point out this feature. This is called Gull Island. It's not labeled here, but I think on some other maps, and you certainly have heard references to it. Who's read The Cut of Her Jib? Yeah. Whose great grandmother wrote it?
Grandmother, not
Grandmother. Sorry, but it was about your great grandmother. So anyway, a few greats in there. Your grandmother wrote it. I was just I read it every few years, and I was reading the other night, and there's a great scene where she's with Captain Mark Hallett coming back from Martha's Vineyard, and they make a really speedy pass. He's got what must have been a Crosby catboat, and it was very fast, and they came across. I don't think it's really plausible, but it's supposed to be 80 minutes from dock to dock. But anyway, they came by Gull Island, and he was keeping chickens on the island. Interesting. I had heard other references to a cow being kept on that island. Now that's a fictional work, but presumably there was some kind of livestock kept on Gull Island, and he was sort of joking about if there was a storm, he'd lose all his chickens. I felt bad for the chickens.
The book is available at the Historical Society.
Oh yeah, great. That's good, and thankfully republished. It used to be hard to get a copy. Okay, so we're really in the heyday of maritime Cotuit in 1856. In Barnstable again, I don't know that it was insisted upon by the Massachusetts legislature, but they did a town map, and it's I probably should have showed the whole thing, but this is a part of the whole thing, and then it had insets for different villages. Let's see, we've still got Gull Island. I don't think it's labeled as such. Sampson's Island, the entrance. Now it's we're back to Osterville Island, from Osterville, Great Island to Grand Island. Now it's Osterville Island. And you do see Little Island, which is called Little Island today, and they do call it Osterville Harbor. You're starting to see the Populated spit creep up, and it's not done. We'll see that it's going to keep going. Somewhere in this presentation, I had to complain about the spelling of Populated, which is all over the place. It tends to be spelled, the way I remember it is single consonant, double consonant, single consonant, double consonant, single consonant, and that's the way it's spelled typically today, although Populated Road in Cotuit is not spelled that way. It isn't P-O-P-P, it's P-O-P, so go figure. I don't know why that is. But you see a lot of different spellings for Populated. If you start to look at the detail here, you've got some significant wharfs, and actually, the one on this west side, there are schooners tied up there, coastal schooners tied up there permanently, and you've got hoopers to the north. So that's sorry. Okay, so that was pretty significant. I was going to mention here. So these Roman numerals, those are school districts. So you actually had a Cotuit school district, which was the northern section. And by the way, we finally have Main Street completed up there now. So it's not just the Newtown Road piece. You've got Main Street going up, and a school up there, and then a school district here. And each had a school. The one here is here. That the building just through the doorway there, and then the one down in the Highland is the Cotuit House, which is green, and it was for many years not green, but it was always called the Green Schoolhouse, presumably historically green, and so they painted it green, which is kind of great. So you had a school in each of those districts, and I guess this was the newest. So we had the 10th district was Cotuit, the 11th was Cotuit Port, and then must have been a bunch of others elsewhere in Barnstable. Now the 21st was what's called the Highland or High Ground or whatever, but here it's Highland. Consistently labeled here as the Highland. And this is the first time when you can start seeing names. And there's a lot of names, a lot of interesting names. We're starting to see names that show up on the Historical Society plaques on many houses. Old Post Road is in evidence over, back over to this map. The cemetery has showed up, and the old part of the cemetery, certainly still has graves where you can read the stones back to this time period. You're starting to see some stores as well. I gather people didn't have too many horses. Most people just walked, and so the stores were quite distributed. There were grocery stores all up and down what we call Main Street today, including some along Ocean View. The one in where Ocean View splits off from Main. There's a house there. That was a store at one point. There was the Handys. A Captain Handy, after retiring, had a shoe store, and you could buy Kodaks. I think I heard them referred to as, and get your film developed. Maybe it was a little later than 1856, but there was a store on Ocean View that had those sorts of things, and just lots of stores. A lot of other today homes along Main Street did have stores, and stores in Cotuit. Grocery stores in the middle of the village, and we'll talk more about those. The church has been built at this point. Right here it says, you can't read it, I can't either, but it says Baptist Church. Again, I talked about the various schools being pictured, and then names. And Ocean View is just lousy with Nickersons. There's a Finney and there's an Adams, but if you swing a dead cat, as they say, you're going to hit a few Nickersons all over the high ground area, and not too many Nickersons elsewhere. Once you get north of the church, there are very, very few Nickersons. So my sense was people used to be a little more territorial, even within Cotuit, hanging out in their villages. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Another thing to point out. I've not. Well, a couple things. You see Marshby still. But I was, what was I going to say? Oh, the loop. Yeah, the loop isn't a loop. The road ends here, and it doesn't loop back up. I'm not sure when it started being called the loop. My guess is there was a footpath up to here or something, but the road kind of dead-ended there. And yet at some point, presumably the name loop is because the road loops back. But that was not for many years. Okay, so in 1880, the town of Barnstable published an atlas. And if you want to take a look at it, you got to know the secret room to go in downstairs, but this is it. And somebody tore the Cotuit map out, so I'm not having to tear it out to show you, but this is the map we're looking at. And this is an original copy back to 1880, so be gentle, but feel free to give it a look. And there's several books like this. There's another map we'll talk about, or another, one of the maps is from a Massachusetts atlas that was a few years after this. We'll get there. But anyway, a lot of these original things are downstairs. There used to be a Cape Cod room, and now it's kind of a storage closet that's jammed full of stuff. The library is pretty tight, but if you want to get to some of these old maps, there are some down there. So a guy called Walker did these. So interesting features. I didn't get too much into the coastline here. It didn't change a lot since the last one, but we've got the lower harbor, which is kind of Loop Beach over to Riley's to Bluff Point, which is kind of interesting. And then upper harbor was the other side of Bluff Point. I'm noticing too the Codman House is now here. So Colonel Codman has come back from the Civil War, and yeah, we'll say some more about that in a minute when we talk about summer residence, because he was one of the early ones. What else did I notice? Oyster Island, little island again, but now at least it's Cotuit Harbor. What we call North Bay and West Bay aren't labeled here. The town dock is kind of in full swing and hadn't been. Most of the wharf activity was up here, but now the town dock is in action in Cotuit Port. And we see stores and the beginnings of hotels. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. What else am I seeing? Oyster Island. Okay, good enough. So you start, oh, I know, yeah, I knew there was something I was missing. So there's a road that goes out along the Narrows, and here it turns into a dotted line and says proposed road with a bridge over the inlet into Prince Cove, which never happened. And if you kept extending it out here, it comes into the road into Osterville at about where Ice Valley Road is today. But that never happened. Would have been kind of cool. You can't really ride your bike to Osterville very easily. That would have taken care of the problem. But you start to see summer residences labeled. So this, you can't see it, but this says summer res, and it's pointing to what I think is the Perkins house. Augustus, yeah, actually it says Augustus Perkins, summer residence. So Augustus Thorndike Perkins was an heir to a East Indies shipping fortune, a China trade fortune, and he built the first mansard roof house. And that's in the mansard story. That was 1863. He built that house. Samuel Hooper is known as the first summer resident, but he moved into a house that was a Crocker house, the one Crocker house that wasn't up on Falmouth Road, which is again what was the Ropes house, and now the Danhauser house just up above the yacht club. So he was a Boston Brahmin, Beacon Hill kind of guy, wealthy. Came down here to recruit captains for his ships, and decided to stay. And so he was considered the first summer resident. But with that house came a lot of land, and so he was selling or gifting land to people he knew. So Colonel Codman was a buddy of his, of Hooper's son, I think, as was George Lowell, who was A. Lawrence Lowell's uncle, had the house. Now I'm up here, the Lowell house on the point between Ropes Beach and the town dock. That was George Lowell's house, circa 1880. He passed away and passed it on to his nephew. Actually, I think his nephew was also his son-in-law. Things worked that way in those days. So you started to see summer houses, and then also hotels. So the Cotuit house, considered by many to be the first hotel, or at least the first resort hotel, has opened up within the last decade, and where are we? It's right about here. So it started with John Coleman just putting up travelers who were waiting the night to get on a coastal schooner to go over to Nantucket or to New Bedford. They'd stay the night, and he started making a business of it and expanded it, and it turned into the Cotuit house, which started to get big, and in its heyday, there were 3 buildings. I imagine it could accommodate hundreds of people, and in those days, people would come and spend a long time, as they also did at the Pines, which was starting up at about this time. A lot of you know about the Pines, but it's down here on Ocean View. So we're certainly starting to see the post-war whaling industry winding down, sailing ships starting to wind down, and summer people beginning to fill in, starting with Samuel Hooper, and then A. Lawrence Lowell bringing a bunch of his buddies down from Harvard later, and as the story continues. Let's see. I guess, yeah. One more observation was. Am I seeing what I'm looking for here? There was a reference to the post office. Post office moved around a lot, but at this point, the post office was in the house in front of my house, which is 842 Main Street, and that was to become. The post office spent a lot of time there, and that was a real social center. It's a little bit that way today. I went to the post office over the weekend and I couldn't get out of there. But in those days, the post came in, I think, in the early afternoon. It came down from Barnstable, and it would get sorted, and the window would be closed, and people would stand around outside and chit chat until the window opened, and the post got handed So this is, I referred to this atlas, a copy of this is downstairs. You don't get, oh, this is where I was looking for the post office. Okay, I was ahead of myself. You know, this was really about Massachusetts. It doesn't have the kind of detail on Cotuit that's that interesting. And so some of the things here, I wonder if they're just mistakes. What I didn't say in the last one is it still referenced Cotuit Port for this area, but this area officially became Cotuit in 1872. So actually before that map, but the map was a little late and this one hadn't caught up. Well, this one had caught up. So this now says Cotuit here. But Charles Burse, who lived in the house, if you come in on Putnam, what used to be Maple, but into Main Street, the house straight ahead was the Charles Burse house. He moved the post office, the official post office, from in what we call Santuit today down to Cotuit Port and just called it Cotuit. And you don't see Santuit here, but I think at about this time is when the term Santuit started to be used. But I do question the accuracy of this map just because it was, you know, part of a pretty big picture map. But you do have Gull Island. Now it's called Gull Island Shoal, so it's probably not visible too much. You have Deep Hole Harbor. This is the first reference I've seen to it. So in that sense, this is accurate. There was a Deep Hole Harbor out off the entrance to the harbor there, and that's where the big ships would stay that couldn't come into the harbor, and it was just the smaller schooners that would sail into the harbor. You see the pond clearly open. This is labeled as Sampson's Island. This is the first reference I've seen to Dead Neck. But then there's some weird stuff too. What we call North Bay is labeled as West Bay. Did they call it that? I don't know. Was it just a typo, a mistake? Not sure. What we call Seapuit is Seapit, S-E-E-P-I-T. That's kind of strange. And then, as I mentioned, the post office. You got these squares represent schools. So you got one here, and then a school. A school where the post office is now. And you see PO here. You might have thought that was the post office. No, if you look at the legend, that dot is a post office. Squares with the dot in them are schools. So you've got the school where the post office is. You got the school right here, some other schools, and the post office at 842 Main. But the real story here is what's going on with this. Part of sandwich and part of sandwich, and it helps to explain this odd appendage that you've probably seen in maps of Cotuit up here with Cotuit sticking into what looks like it should be Mashpee. But you know, what's Sandwich doing here? Well, Reverend Richard Bourne, who was kind of around in the Miles Standish time, seemed a pretty good guy, sympathetic to the Indians. Of course, he wanted to bring Christianity to all the Indians, but he was instrumental in getting the plantation of Marshby designated as Indian land, and over the years, it was sort of nipped away at the edges here and there. And I talked about the border moving over to the east side of the river and such. But anyway, I haven't explained Sandwich. So in comes a guy called Gideon Hawley, Reverend Gideon Hawley, and he's given responsibility. What's the date? 1891. So it was before the Revolutionary War. So probably early 1870s. Hawley's given responsibility for bringing Christianity to the Indians, and he's at least the natives' eye view in retrospect is he wasn't a great guy. He kind of led this movement to take away self-rule from the Indians in Mashpee and bring in a board of governors to tell them what they could and couldn't do. And he kind of turned his nose up at the natives and didn't want to really have anything to do with Mashpee other than his job. He married a woman his name was Fletcher, I think, from Sandwich, and he wanted to be involved in Sandwich and be able to vote there and all that. So somehow pulled some shenanigans and got this, and then this land, which is as you go over the bridge into Mashpee to the north, where the Spanish castle was, and kind of north of there. This is about 80 acres, and this is about 125 acres that he got not only in his possession, but made part of the town of Sandwich. And this didn't get resolved until early in the 1900s. So 1905, Mashpee gets this land back from Sandwich, and then it was in about 1916 that Cotuit worked a deal with Barnstable worked a deal with Sandwich and got the Hawley lot made part of Barnstable. And it had been sold off. It was now out of the Hawley family. There was a guy called Harlow who was given what was south of the road. And I think I have it in my notes. Who got the other piece? Harlow. Oh yes, David Crocker. David Crocker already lived in the Hawley lot north of the road. And that was given to him, and through that all became part of Sandwich. I'm sorry, Barnstable. Karen Hallett, who has an old house here, told me, and I haven't seen it yet, but she says there's a granite marker off in the woods that marks the border between Mashpee and Sandwich. So that's kind of interesting. I had actually intended to see it before I gave this talk, but I never got around to that. Okay, so now we've got a harbor plan, and again, I wonder with these more coastal-oriented maps, how literal to take some of the inland features, because they were more focused on the coast. But I mean, some interesting stuff. The most interesting thing is the planned cut. So it would be 2 years later, I think, or maybe a year later, 1898 or 1899, the cut was actually put through. But it was pretty controversial. It kind of reminded me of the controversy here over dredging, but I think even more so. And the captains in Cotuit were pretty against it and lobbied hard, and ended up losing the battle. And the cut went through, and a big part of their argument was that it was going to impact the coastline. And as we'll see, and as we know now, and we'll see from subsequent maps, it pretty quickly did impact the coastline. But yeah, that was to happen. Other things you see, there's a reference to Dead Neck Beach, which is kind of interesting. I've never heard the neck called that, but it's called Dead Neck Beach. And then oddly, this is called Dead Neck. What we call Garrison's Point over here is called Dead Neck. Grand Island's Grand Island, so that's good. Gull Island's gone. Sampson's is Sampson's. Bluff Point and such. Handy's Point. And I can't tell if it's with an apostrophe or not, or just Handy's plural or Handy apostrophe S. Point Isabella is noted for the first time, named after Fran Parks's great grandmother, I think, whose name was Mary Isabella Dupee, and I guess maybe great grandmother, because her grandmother, I think Fran's grandmother was Isabella's daughter, Carolyn Dupee Nazaro. So the Nazaros were there for a while. The Narrows is called the Narrows. So we're starting to see things in common use. North Bay is North Bay, but West Bay is South Bay. Not sure what to make of that. Again, I question the roads, but some things to see. Loop still isn't a loop. It's not looping back. The interesting thing for me is this is Nickerson Road, and it seems pretty clearly to go off, kind of bend north. And I think, and then you see, now I'm lost. Yeah, so you see School Street starting to go out that way, and then bend south, and they join, which is kind of interesting. The other thing you see up here is this is High Street, this is School Street, and then this is a diagonal through the through the rectangle that's bounded today by Lake Street, School Street, High Street, and Highland. So I looked into that stuff, and Jim Gould had some theories here too. So I'll share his theories, and I think there's some interesting evidence. So if you look at this is 2023 Barnstable property map. This is shown as sort of a road, and you can see the lot lines respect this angled road through that rectangle, more like a square, I guess. And Jim's theory on that was that there was a road, an ancient road was the way he referred to it, that split off kind of near Coolidge and Old Oyster today, and went all the way down to Crocker's Neck. And I didn't get enough from him, on why, but that angle lines up pretty neatly with the angle of Crocker's Neck there. And the other thing you'll see, this is 125 School Street. It's the driveway. There's a driveway that cuts off the corner between Highland and School Street, and it lines up perfectly with, this is sort of a driveway road. There's a couple of houses back in here. And that angle kind of lines up perfectly. So I don't know if that substantiates it or not. The other of Jim's theories, and there was nothing shown on the previous map to get there, but he thought that if you look at the back of these lots along High Street, like behind the fire station and some of the mansard roof houses along here, they're angled funny. They're not parallel to either Main Street or High Street. And so he thought there were two old, he said ancient roads. I haven't seen any other evidence other than what I showed you on that map, but he thought there was one that came down behind here, and that's Old Oyster and that's Oyster Place, and that may have been a road that went back before the maps were accurate enough to show it. So the logic behind some of those theories has died with Jim, but the theory lives on. Okay, so we're now into the 20th century, and Cotuit has really transitioned much into a summer community. The population has begun to decline. So really, it peaked at about 500 people and about 100 houses around the Civil War, and now we're down to about 400. It's hard to know how much of that is winter, summer, both. Even today, the town of Barnstable doesn't really have a clear picture of, how many winter residents and summer residents, and what are you? What am I? Are we like both 4/7, full time? It's kind of hard to say. But anyway, the population has begun to decline, at least in the census, and I went back and looked through the census. So you see Santuit showing up as vocabulary for the first time. Santuit is an inset here. Main Street is starting to be called Main Street. And now we're getting into some of the answers to some of the mysteries that I was identifying at the beginning. So these are really weird. So you've got Handy Street. This is C Street, so we're connecting Main and Ocean View. It's called Handy Street. It's pretty logical because there's Captain Handy's on either side of it. The store I was referring to, the shoe store and camera store is right here. But now you got what we call Cross Street is called Shore Street. Reasonably logical, but I have no idea why it changed. I have some idea when it changed, just because when the maps changed. But that was being called Shore Street. But that's a perfectly good name for a street. Why not? But they lost that. I'm just realizing something I forgot in the street mysteries, which I'll have to go back to. And then here you've got what we call Nickerson Road is Cross Street, which of course we call Shore Street Cross Street. So, and what's it going across to? Maybe what they mean is this is Cross Street. It goes all the way across to somewhere. I'm not sure. The one I forgot to show you here is Bayview Road. I also forgot to mention Santuit Road, which is it's calling Poppanesset Santuit Road. I think it's just a mistake, but who knows? But yeah, Bayview Road, and that turns out to be legit. I found, I looked at deeds from back in this time frame, and in fact, what we would call Old Post Road was referred to as Bayview Road then. But that wasn't the only thing that was referred to as Bayview Road. We'll have another. Yeah, so the street names are interesting. You've got the, yeah, you can't see the details up here, but you've got the Cotuit School, which is in what we would call Cotuit still, always called Cotuit. For some reason it was called the Cotuit School, which is where the post office is. And today, as you may know, there was a funny land swap at some point. I can't articulate the details real well, but it ended up with the church owning the land where the post office is, and leasing it to the federal government to put a post office there. But at this time, it was a school, and then you have the hotels, as I mentioned. You got the Pines here, which was putting up people for the whole summer often. Cotuit House is in full swing, and this was really the height of the hotel business in Cotuit. The church has moved to its current site, and the downtown of Cotuit is starting to coalesce into an actual town with a lot more commercial activity than we have today. So 1911 harbor plan, and the cut's been put through about a decade earlier, a little more than a decade earlier. And what's happened? Well, all of a sudden, there's no entrance to the harbor where it used to be. Sampson's has joined up with what's here called Dead Neck Beach, and this is correctly called Seapuet River. West Bay is called West Bay, North Bay is called North Bay, Cotuit Harbor is Cotuit Harbor. Things are starting to feel normal. And so now you've got a deep water channel coming in here, and the current entrance to the harbor with, of course, a much wider mouth than we see today. Today, this island sticks in, something like that. The other thing that's happened is that the pond is starting to get closed in, Rushy Marsh Pond, and the spit from Populated is significantly creeping up, and this is where I wanted to complain about the spelling of Populated, but I've done so already, so I'll spare you. So they, in the day, in the 1800s, when an insurance company wanted to insure a building, they had to send somebody there to look at the building. And there was the Sanborn Map Company saw a business opportunity and started up this business in producing maps that were it was just after the Civil War, producing maps that were of sufficient quality that the insurance underwriters could write the policies based just on what was in the maps. And so we end up with is fantastically detailed maps of mostly urban areas all around the United States. You can get these you can find them online. The Library of Congress has them. They're pretty accessible, and they're extremely detailed. So you can see this is School Street in Maine. So 1916, we've got the Coop and a jewelry store, in which the fire started in 1924 and burned down the Coop, and Milton Crocker had to move it up the street. But another story. You've got a store here, the Benjamin Sears General and Grocery Store. You've got a confectionery, another confectionery over here. Leonard Peck used to tell stories of both of those confectioneries carrying fireworks, and you had this was called Versus, and I don't remember the name of this one at this time, but you had the Versus gang and the other gang shooting fireworks back and forth across Main Street at each other and getting resupplied in the confectionery. You've got the church and Bruce Hall separate. You've got the public school, again called the Cotuit School, oddly. The Cotuit Inn is now on the scene. So just really, really great maps. You can almost see the floor plan of the Cotuit Inn, at least the footprint. This is where I see Maple referenced, but it doesn't say street or avenue. It just says Maple, even if you extend off the map. So no answers there on that part of the question. But you've got the coop here. Coolidge is called private way at this point, and Piney. I didn't go down that far, but Piney shows up on the map down here, but as no name. Not that there is no name. It says no name. So there was a road, but it wasn't called Piney yet.
Hey Phil.
Yeah.
So the store that's at the corner of School in Maine was that an actual Sears store? Or
No.
was
So
it
Benjamin
named
Sears,
for a
nothing to do
person?
with Sears Roebuck. Just a
Yeah.
guy called Benjamin Sears.
I see.
And the fire station's here. Not too long after the fire station moved around the corner onto High Street. But this was very active, and Keith can tell you he remembers. The downtown was a real downtown.
And was the post office still on the street, or?
Let's see, 1916. I'm trying to think. Soon after the post office moved in. This building got expanded, and the post office moved into that building. But I think 1916. It was still at 842 Main. And the post. So there was a postmaster, Andrew Lovell. Andrew Lovell moved from Little River to the Zace's house, what's called Big Red, the house at the corner of Lowell Avenue and Putnam, and then bought my house in 1867. He became soon after became the postmaster, and so he ran the post office there. I don't have the good details on this, but Washington politics set off the Cotuit post office wars, where it was sort of back and forth between Republican and Democrat. So Grover Cleveland got elected, and they yanked the post office away from Republican Lovell and gave it to, I think, Addie Burse at this point, who's Charles Burse's niece or something, and the post office moved across the street to that little narrow house where Peter Salisbury lives. But then anyway, it moved back, and then Lovell's daughter, whose name I should remember, but Lizzie Lovell was postmistress for a number of years. So I'm pretty sure 1916 she was still postmistress. This was an interesting one. I found one copy of this, but it was a real estate. It's titled "Real Estate Developers Map," as you can see, real estate developments, and it was done by Noyce and Bond Engineers. I tried to get in touch at 676, but they didn't answer. That was the phone number, Depot Square, phone 676. So, again, it's another one of these maps that, you wonder the accuracy of, and certainly it's showing the old harbor entrance and Gull Island, so it's, clearly way off. The purpose seemed to be to show places where developers wanted to build stuff. And so you can see there's, it extended, we're just looking at the Cotuit part, it went across Barnstable and into Mashpee. But you've got Craigville Heights, Craigville Estates, some of these other places. And so we've got 4, 5, and 7 in Cotuit. So 4 is here, and it's kind of out in what we would call the coves, out on Papaneset Bay. And that was to be called Cotuit High Grounds, oddly. Never happened, or it did get developed. It was just didn't get developed soon after 1626. Then you've got Cotuit Shore was down here, so this would be more or less Vineyard Road, beyond Oregon, which thankfully has not been densely developed. And then over here you've got 7, which is Cotuit Park in Mashpee, just north once you cross the river. Refer to the Cotuit River here, not the Santuit River, but again, who knows the accuracy. So this you can't quite read, but this is where it says Charlie Giffords Road. So Charlie Gifford was the congressman. He was kind of a mover and a shaker. Bought up a bunch of land all over the place. He was somewhat involved with the development of the land around the golf course. And by the way, Cotuit Golf Course was in business at this point, but not labeled. But Santuit Golf Club is. And you may remember there was a golf course up there where there's now a housing development across the river from Willow Bend. But we got Falmouth Road, State Road, Charlie Gifford's Road, all the same road. So the State Road came in through town. So people would come into the center of town and go up to get back on the State Road, being Route 28. And around this time there was a flashing light in the center of town to facilitate that. You do see Piney Road, I think labeled as such. Maple Street, labeled as Maple Street. And Coolidge shows up, although I don't know that it's called Coolidge, but you see Coolidge coming here and extending sort of along Moose Pine Road. What else? Yeah, Crocker Neck is referred to, you can't read it, but it's referred to as Crocker's Road, probably just a mistake. You see a little bit of Shell Lane sticking in here and labeled as such. And Loop is finally a loop. This is the first time we see Loop connected. So so another best laid plan. I don't know, anybody seen this before? Yeah, it's pretty interesting. This was the Frederick Law Olmsted plan for developing oyster harbors. At the time, Oyster Harbors was developed here. You had a bunch of families, starting with the Channings, and Edward Channing was a buddy of A. Lawrence Lowell's. He was a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, but better known as the father of Alice Channing, who was the first Commodore of the Cotuit Mosquito Yacht Club, which is now up and running as of 1906. But there was the Sturos along here, the Platt family, a number of Boston families, but a small number, a handful, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I think this says Lowell, and the Lowell lot was never built. I understand A. Lawrence Lowell bought it to provide a buffer for Channing. But the idea was this rather dense development on Grand Island, including a causeway across Cotuit River onto Dead Neck so that you could access the polo fields and tennis courts. So that's still under construction.
It's in the planning stage.
Yeah, it's still in the early stages. Okay, so now we're at Cotuit on a wartime footing, 1943. This is a USGS map. And the most interesting feature is what's called Camp Cotuit on here, and maybe it started as that, but I think pretty quickly became Can Do It. And I think there was one in Austria, it was Camp Will Do It or something like the sister camp. They were associated with Camp Edwards, and it was training Army personnel to make beach landings in the South Pacific. Yeah, pretty interesting. The other feature that distracts from, though, is look at Poppanesset Spit. Up, almost to the middle of Russian Marsh Pond. So you got Oregon Beach here now, or now what we call Oregon Beach, and a long river in. And a plug for one of my oral histories, Wingate Lloyd did a great oral history. And so circa 1943, he's spending the summer at the Lloyd's house here, and he and Terry go sailing up to Cotuit for a race, and they come back one day, and there's a Bailey Bridge across the river. Bailey Bridge was brought in sections on trucks and built so it was a temporary bridge that the Army would use to ford streams, and so they were training and building this thing, and so Terry and Wingate are trying to get home, and there's this bridge there, and so the young officer gets 8 of his guys, and they pick up the skiff, walk it around, and so Terry and Wingate would get cordaged around by the army legs, for a few days until the Bailey Bridge exercises were done. So let's see. I'd never seen this before. Oyster Harbor's beach is the outside of Dead Neck. That was unusual. But I guess if you step back, and if you're in the back of the room, what you can probably see is this is kind of how I remember Cotuit as a kid. Fairly populated along this swath of Main Street and School Street, but not much anywhere else. And that was, that wasn't going to stay forever, but that was the way it felt at the time. And so, of course, now the big development of Cotuit has been everywhere else. The bottle, probably a lot of you know about the bottle, but this was discovered a year or so ago on Point Isabella, and it was evidently there were POWs working, doing, I don't know, wood, out in the woods chopping trees or something on Point Isabella. Larry, my father, remembers in the hurricane of '44, a lot of German POWs cleaning up after the hurricane. So they were used, for various labors, and these guys wrote some notes in a bottle, stuck it in the bottle, and so another plug for the Historical Society, trying to raise some money to be able to get that paper out of the bottle in a responsible way that it preserves it and can be kept up. And we got to get an expert to do that. So that's a project that's going. But very interesting, and the landscaper who found it was terrific. He didn't bust the bottle and see what was inside. And thought to bring it to the Historical Society. So it's a great, invaluable historical piece for the Historical Society. What else was I going to comment on? Just where there isn't population here, there's still a bunch of roads and the fire roads, but they were just dirt roads that mix things up. Oh, I was going to say just on POWs, I read an article a couple years ago. I think it was 47 of the 48 continental U.S. states, or what were states at the time, had POW camps. I came across one in northern New Hampshire, way the hell of northern New Hampshire, and there's a little plaque by the side of the road. And a lot of the POWs ended up staying around. Many went back to Germany, but at the end of the war, some of them found girlfriends and stayed and became citizens. So this is a map probably many of you have seen. It was circa 1960, put together by the real estate firm of Phyllis Dudley and her partner Dorothy Kerr as a kind of promotional giveaway, I think, to customers. And they must have commissioned Ralph Cahoon to do it because it's copyright, not Ralph Cahoon, but Dudley and Kerr. And it's a great map. It's got a lot of cool stuff on it. Well, I'll tell the punchline first. So I was here for a civic association board meeting a couple of weeks ago, and the Maple Street question was on my mind. And I can't find my copy of the map, so I'm working off this not very high resolution JPEG, and I'm trying to zoom in and see Maple Street, but I can't really read it. And so I walked in and, there's a copy over here, and I wandered over and got up close. That's the original gang. And I've walked by it how many times over the last few decades, but you walk up, you go up close and there's brush strokes and stuff, and I hope the library is well insured because Cahoons go for a pretty penny these days. What you see now is the Popponesset Spit has receded by 1960, so over 15 years or so. And this is my memory of an ever-changing spit that enclosed a lagoon. And as recently as, I don't know, mid-early 70s, there were probably half a dozen boats that would moor inside that lagoon in the summer. Smaller boats, a day sail or a whale or a couple. I don't know that I ever saw a skiff in there, but there were a few boats in there. And that gentleman over there and I had a few nice sleepovers on that spit.
Rained on every time.
It rained on every time. We threw pudding at each other. It was great. But it shifted back and forth. And for a while, it was connected at the south end and open at the north end. mostly what I remember is this way, and now unfortunately it's gone because it was a great fun resource for kids. You go to Oregon Beach and there's not a lot of beach there, but you could swim across and basically have free, a lot of free beach there. So it's gone away, and then it really built up in front of what was the Wessons, now the courthouse. So there's several more acres that they're paying taxes on. Too bad, but it would have been nice to have the spec. And again, these are little tree icons that just show, this is all woods back in here. You start to see the first signs of Kellyville, another paper in the back of my mind, but that's pretty interesting. Kellyville's 50 or 60 houses, all built at the same time, quite affordable at the time, really ahead of its time in terms of giving Cotuit some affordable housing. And what's interesting to me is how they've all evolved. There are a few that haven't been touched, but the vast majority have been added onto in every imaginable way. And it's just really interesting, the different things that have been done with those houses. In Kellyville there was three brothers called Kelly who were developers from Boston who came down and got the land. It was I think 1 acre zoned, and they split it into, I think it's half-acre lots. They're still pretty big lots for small houses. I also picked another map, like contemporary map at the time, just to give you the answer to the other Bayview. So if you remember, Old Post Road used to be called Bayview, but this is Nickerson, and it looks like it was called Bayview Road. What I think is the reality is where Nickerson bends south, from there, so that's here, there down into here was called Bayview. I don't think that first block of Nickerson was ever called Bayview, but this was a development to be, and it was called Bayview Estates. It lacked a view of the bay, but that didn't prevent the idea. So you can find maps in the deed registry of plans to build Bayview Estates. So that was the reference there. All right, we're starting to see the finish line. I came across through my looking about some hand-drawn beauty. So if you buy the collection of Cotuit Historical Society papers, one of them was a kind of 3-part paper. It's also published on the Fire District website on the history of Cotuit. And one of the 3 papers is about the stores on Main Street. So Walter Scudder, who had the gas station there for many years, did a very detailed map of this is A, B, C, D, and it tells you, you can go and look at the key and see what all of these different structures are. So that one I knew about. I was doing an oral history at Barb LeClaire's house with her and her sister Susan, and they gave us a little tour of the house, which had been Seabury Child's house, and was part of, he married into the Dockridge family. And they've got a map that's 6 or 7 feet long, hand-drawn, circa 1856, with names of all these houses. And there's this other one hanging in the Historical Society office, another one of these things I walked by a million times before noticing. And that was from 1880, and same thing, hand-drawn maps with names of who lives in the houses written in. So my theory, and I think it's a pretty good one, is when the Walling map was done in 1856, and the 1880 Barnstable County Walker map was done, they must have had to go to the locals if they wanted the names of who lived where. And so my guess is they hired somebody to do a hand-drawn map that they cleaned up for publication, but that these were the originals from which these are being worked. Total theory, I have no proof, except they line up in time and in content very well with the published maps. Barb offered if I wanted to bring it over tonight, I could, but it's really big. Okay, so now we're finally in the home stretch. There are, as I said at the beginning, it's just a wonderful time if you're into maps. There are all kinds of resources available. This is from the town of Barnstable Local comprehensive plan is in the process of being done. And there's a bunch of, this is an example of one of more than a dozen maps. And this is, I think zoning is the way they say it, but land use, it might be called. But these tanned areas are all residential. And so now you can see, Cotuit's gotten pretty residential. Thankfully, we've got some nice Barnstable Land Trust here, and we've got the Crocker Neck Preserve here, and of course we've got the island and patches of different places that have been preserved, much of it by the Barnstable Land Trust. So we've still got some green, which is great, but it's really pretty dense, and we're up to it's still a little hard to get a number, but more than 2,000 homes. Many of them built in the 80s and 90s, and a lot of them in the vicinity of Route 28. So off Putnam, off Old Post, off Falmouth Road, and even north of Falmouth Road, and up towards Lovell's Pond, which we don't really think of as Cotuit, but there's a lot of Cotuit there, and a significant percentage of the winter population in particular live up that way. So it's gotten pretty dense. Although thankfully, if you drive down Main Street and squint your eyes, it still looks like old Main Street Cotuit, which is nice. So lots of great maps from the planning, the local comprehensive plan. Cape Cod Commission has a fantastic website with a lot of really interesting maps. I showed you a couple samples, but this is a 3D one. And you can kind of go in and change the angle and zoom in. You got to have a pretty good computer. I have a really weak little laptop and it's slow, but if you got a pretty good computer, it's really great. This is a chronology map, so you can take, this is a photograph circa 1930, I think, and this is a photograph circa now, and you can kind of slide back and forth between them and see, what's underneath for 1930 versus now. There's a map of car crashes. There's a map of sea level rise. There's a map of solar screening map, which is useful for deciding where to place solar cells. There's a map that shows current pavement conditions based on surveying drivers. So lots of interesting stuff from map buffs today. There's more modern maps. The town of Barnstable has a bunch of good maps. The Barnstable property map is great for snooping on your neighbors if you want to see who owns what and how much they paid, and you get a little history on every house. There's a map on ways to water, zoning, trails around the town of Barnstable. Cemetery search is interesting. So Marion Odence is buried right there. Just put it in, bingo, it highlights the plot, and you can find anybody you want to go visit. And then, as I said at the beginning, the Historical Society has a great map. I encourage you to look at it. It's pretty easy. I'm going to tell you, it's not the easiest thing to use, but with a little bit of patience, we can figure it out. And it's a great gateway to a wealth of information about all the houses. And I think, one of my goals in working with the Historical Society is to make all of the resources more accessible. And the Historical Society is very accommodating, particularly now that there'll be some space. We're accommodating before, but if you go visit Cindy, you're in a closet next to Cindy, and she's great, but it's kind of tight. But there's going to be a lot of space. You're welcome to the Historical Society. But my goal is to make it so if you want to learn what information exists about a house in Cotuit, you can get there. You can get much of it online, and we're trying to make that people and these oral histories and all that stuff. So. That's a map I'll encourage you all to visit. I'm not going to torture you with a quiz, but County Road we probably didn't talk about. That was Main Street, pretty much, but not quite Main Street. Newtown, Maine, down to, turned into Ocean View before Main Street went down there. And a funny little vignette, Sydney was doing some research and she asked me what the name of Ocean View had been before it was called Ocean View. I was kind of busy. I said, I'll get to it this weekend. So I went on the weekend and I was looking at some deeds. And I pulled up a couple of deeds. And the deeds often tell you, what the boundaries are. And so the boundary said that this property was bordered on the east side by the road. Before it was called County Road, it was called the road. East Main Street, I didn't mention, I should have pointed out. So that is the part of Old Shore that runs down next to my house. So if you're going the wrong way, let's say you're coming up from the Hooper's Landing. That was called East Main Street. Handy Street we talked about was now C Street. The Bayview Avenues was Old Post we talked about, and that piece of Nickerson. Shore Street was Cross Street. Charlie Giffords Road we saw was aspirational, I think, but that might have been the name of Quinquisset. And then Maple Street, I still don't know if it's street or avenue. As I say, I've seen references to both, and I have no idea why it changed. I have an idea when it changed. It changed about 1980 because David Sherbuck got back from graduating from Yale, and his grandmother Nellie made him put up a number on the house because they'd just gotten a number, and that was when the numbers changed. And I'm pretty sure that Maple Street turned into Putnam. I think it was something to do with getting numbers, but I haven't been able to get anybody. I've talked to people in town, nobody quite knows how that happens, and I don't even know what makes it official. So that's what's curious about history. With that, I'm gonna take a breath, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer.
We are running a little long, but if you have one or two questions or Phil's around, I'll
Yeah, email, anything? Val, you just waving
Yeah,
at?
are there, you mentioned a store from Coolidge Street and going down,
Yeah.
road and a store. Now, there was a building there, at the end of Coolidge Street across Main, is that what, that was supposedly a store at one time?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. David Sherbuck and I were talking about that building. It's a beautiful, what was an interesting, beautiful old building. Interesting pillars that are made of trees. It's on what was the Moore's property.
Yeah,
I think Nicky Moore's family still owns it. I'm not sure if that was. I think that was a store. It's likely. I'm not sure
well,
if it
that's
was
what
a.
my husband always told me.
Okay, well, it was probably a store, but there was the Colemans had a store at the foot of the hill,
Okay.
kind of next to what was the blacksmith shop at the time, which is the Porter Cottage now, right on Old Shore Road there.
The lots at Kellyville, I think, were about a third of an acre.
Okay,
Let's say a third.
good. I think now that you say it, I think that's right, and I'm confusing it. I was looking at how big all the lots were up along the developments along Route 28. Those are half acre, but I think you're right. It's a third. Yeah.
And when I first came here, my husband grew up here, but when I first came here in '66, we rented from Mary Leland, which was just up from the garage.
Yeah, yeah.
And in the phone book, it listed us as SAN.
Huh.
So we were considered Santuit.
Okay, yeah.
But everybody got confused because they said, well, do you live in Sandwich?
San something.
So nobody knew that was Santuit,
Yeah.
and people
No,
that
interesting.
didn't know that were
Even-
looking for us.
Even then.
Yeah, so back then it was.
I believe on 28th there's a Crocker House that was formerly the Regatta in
Yeah.
Bellagio.
Yeah.
Was that the original post office?
I think you're right. I think that.
In the library too, I heard.
Yeah, I think both of those things are true.
Did you go on the walk last Sunday?
No.
Oh.
Told you about that.
Well,
and Tommy just left.
that's cool, thanks.
All right, sorry to run out. I'll stick around if anybody has more questions, but don't feel like you got to stay. I know.
Let me just thank, quick announcement. Thank you for everything you do. We have one more lecture for Cotuit Chronicles this year. It's next month, Thursday, October 19th, here, 7 p.m. again. And we're going to have Dan Zotto talking about Native American artifacts from the Cotuit area. And anyone that's the first time here, if you could just sign in with your name and email address, we'd appreciate it. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.